with all this incredible history in mind, Cuba is still under blockade and it's only worsened. I wanted to ask you about how this blockade has gotten worse, specifically under, you mentioned Trump, but also continued under Biden. And I do want to ask you also about Cuba's like amazing COVID response. But before we get into that, also how is this blockade specifically hampering Cuba's ability to respond the way it would like to COVID, and of course the other living conditions that have deteriorated as a result?
Okay, so I mean, just one quick example. At the beginning of COVID, Cuban medical scientists sent a team, literally January 2020, sent a team to China to study the virus, to learn from their Chinese counterparts what was happening. And it was clear that they said it was clear to us we were going to need ventilators, medical ventilators for ICU units, because this was a respiratory disease. And they immediately set out to try and get new medical ventilators. However, in the response, I think it was in the response to COVID, you had this incredible monopolization of resources by the wealthy countries and by private companies. They had previously bought medical ventilators from two Swiss companies, and they had been bought out by a US company. And under US legislation, which is, by the way, is should only be relevant in US jurisdiction, but is implemented extraterritorially, those Swiss companies could no longer sell their medical ventilators, nor could they even sell them spare parts for the ventilators they had. So that is just one example. Another is you may have remember that Jack Ma from Alibaba, the Chinese corporation, made a donation of PPE and other equipment for Latin American, Caribbean countries for dealing with COVID. And because the donation was being flown in a US aircraft, it couldn't land in Cuba and drop off the donation for Cuba. So, I mean, this has just been on and on. One of the biggest things that happened, we can do this in statistics, right? Trump came in and he, started making threatening noises. And like many people thought, well, this blockade's been going for 60 years. It's comprehensive. It's based on 6 major legal statutes in the United States. It's already extraterritorial. What more can they do? But somehow they found ways to extend and deepen the sanctions, which make them unprecedented. 243 new coercive sanctions, and other measures taken to make Cuba's access to resources more difficult, to the international financial system, to international trade, to block off partnerships, to scare off investors, and including over 50 of them since the pandemic began. And one of the most aggressive and detrimental measures was a few days before Trump left office, maybe even the day before, I can't quite remember. But very vindictively, the US administration put Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Now, Cuba had been on that list, and Obama only removed Cuba from the list shortly before the end of his mandate. However, in the interim, banks have been, caught in big money laundering scandals, and so they have massively strengthened their departments for, securing themselves against fines and accusations of wrongdoing. And there is incredible fear among international financial institutions of being fined, and with good reason, because fines for violating US, they are national jurisdiction, but they are applied extraterritorially because countries won't stand up against US, power structure. There have been multi-million and even multi-billion-dollar fines against financial institutions for transactions with Cuba, as well as Iran and another handful of countries. I mean, a French bank was fined under Obama nearly $9 billion. So you're talking about really heavy fines. and financial institutions are terrified. Cuba's been put back on this list by Trump, hasn't been removed by Biden. And basically what that means is the number of banks in the world that will even contemplate a transaction with Cuba today, you can count on one hand and possibly two fingers. So, what does this mean? How can Cuba engage and carry out trade and get payment for its medical services overseas? How can people send donations, people send remittances? Every single, what should be a standard systemic, interaction with Cuba has become extraordinarily difficult because of these incredibly punitive sanctions. And it's clear that no one in the world thinks that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. No other country, no other government, even a hostile government, has come out and said, they support that statement. It's absolutely punitive. And it's very clear that they feel that they are creating a pressure cooker in Cuba, and they just need to push a bit further. And, they think that the revolutionary regime, the society will collapse. Well, there are big problems in Cuba. The Cubans are really suffering, but that collapse is not imminent. And what is actually happening is that Cubans are being forced to suffer more and more on a daily basis, needlessly. I mean, scarcities of medicine. So if you go back into pharmacies, it's reminiscent of those 1990 conditions that I talked about. Queues. I've been to Cuba twice during the pandemic, and I live with a Cuban family, and they like everyone else, they're up at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning to go and stand in queues for shops that sometimes don't even open till 10 or 11. And the government is, gives people a ticket each, and you stand in line, and the government is trying to, as it did in the 1990s, ensure that a shrinking pie is being shared out as equally as possible, so no one is starving. But the level of daily suffering is rising, and it is exhausting. I mean, things are slightly better now. I feel more positive than if we, who I was talking to in the summer, because the COVID situation has essentially been conquered. Almost the entire Cuban population is fully vaccinated. They're very close to that figure. So among the leading few countries in the world, and the first country in the world to vaccinate all of their children from 2 years up. So, the schools have opened, the borders have opened. Again, we'll have to see what happens with Omicron, but the borders have opened. There's a lot of there's people are very keen to get back to Cuba, to go and visit Cuba. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, the sanctions against Cuba have been punishing, really, really punishing. And again, it's creating an economic crisis, but it's externally forced. It's externally imposed on Cuba. And it is interesting to see the extent to which they are going back and looking at some of the creative solutions and collective solutions that they had during the 1990s.
Yeah, it's really, but it makes Marco Rubio feel better. So that's the upside. But no, it's unbelievably cruel. And of course, it's not just Cuba that these sorts of policies are being implemented against. I think right now the US is sanctioning a third of the world. It's insane. But Cuba really seems like gets the worst of it, and also kind of the lab for it. I mean, Cuba's been under blockade for so long. That's where all of those methods of really, punishing the population at large, I think, were tested out on. And I think one thing that's been really interesting to see is how Cuba was the only country in Latin America to develop this incredibly effective vaccine. I think it's 93 or 94% efficacy, which is as high as the vaccines, as the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. Yet they had to appeal to the international solidarity movement for syringes because of this blockade. I mean, it's completely insane.